welcome everyone to the Dean's Grand Rounds. Today we're talking about allyship and veterinary medicine. So I'll start by giving a definition of allyship, then we'll move into talking about why it's important, introduce our panelists, and then we'll get started. So to make sure that we're all on the same page, and you can see the screen, correct?
Yes.
Perfect. So allyship, I have two definitions for everyone. The first one is a lifelong process of building relationships based on trust, consistency, and accountability with marginalized individuals and or groups of people. Our second definition that we're drawing from is an active, consistent, and arduous practice of unlearning and reevaluating in which a person holding systemic power seeks to end oppressions in solidarity with a group of people who are systematically disempowered. So a couple of things stand out to me from there. Lifelong, active, constant reevaluating. So the process of allyship is not just one and done. You have to constantly think about your learning and your unlearning and work to become a better ally at all times. So Dr. Gashin's going to explain why we're here. What makes allyship so important?
Thanks, Donnie. Yeah, thank you, everyone. And I just want to do a first little shout out to our affinity groups, the student organizations like Voice, Broad Spectrum, the Student Association of Black Veterinarians, and the newly developing Latinx group. And note that this topic really came from the students. This came over the summer. This was an idea that slowly developed with the Student Association of Black Veterinarians, and they created this idea for doing a Grand Rounds topic on allyship. And I really want to thank all of those students and those affinity groups for all their efforts in this school and also in the form of allyship. So why this topic? Allyship is, when I think of it, it's not a vocabulary word that I had when I was a kid. I didn't grow up with this word. Somebody didn't explain it to me. And then I think that growing up, it sort of happens passively. Every one of us is here in the veterinary profession in one form or another, in one role or another, because someone either supported us or helped us or mentored us along the way. So we were profiting from allyship along our journey to get into the veterinary profession, right? And you may have not even noticed it, but today we're going to look at a little bit deeper, like considering the importance of really active allyship in our school, in our classroom, our hospital, our research labs, because these are in effect our work families. We want to everyone in those groups, no matter what group you're in our school, in our profession, to feel like we're a part of it. We don't want anyone in a clinic you work in, for example, to feel isolated or left out. We want to be there for our work colleagues and our teams. And so really, I just wanted to give an overview of why it's so important to our profession and success of everyone. I just wanted to mention that the lastly, so we can get started, is the chat. So for anyone, after during the Q&As, you listen to the panelists talk about the different aspects of allyship. Please start chatting your questions in the chat room, and Donnie and I are going to record those, and then we're going to pose them to the panelists during the Q&A session. And it will be anonymous, so you don't have to worry about that either. Thank you, and I thank everyone for listening and open mind, and let's learn about allyship today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gashin. All right, so let's introduce our panelists. So our first panelist is Dr. Henry Green. Henry Green is a 99 grad of LSU. He did his internship at the University of Tennessee and his residency at cardiology at Purdue, where he's been for the last 17 years or so. But he just came to work for us earlier this year, so we are happy to have him back. And he was recently elected the chair of the diversity committee. So we are looking forward to all that he has planned for us in the next few years. Our next panelist is Wes Heath. Wes Heath got a dual bachelor's in sociology and psychology from Manchester University, as well as a master's degree in sociology, and he's planning to get his PhD in higher education administration in May. Wes oversees Hispanic, Native American, Asian American, and LGBTQ student affairs at LSU. And then our final panelist is Summer Steib. Summer Steib is the director of the Women's Center, as well as the chair of the LSU Bias Incident Response Team. She's a Lighthouse advocate and pregnancy advocate, as well as one of the co-organizers for the National Coalition Building Institute at LSU. So please join me in welcoming our panelists. Again, we want to encourage you to send your questions in the chat to me or Dr. Gashin, but throughout the rest of it, please share encouragements to our panelists, to anything that strikes you, let us know. All right, so here we have our image of allyship. In the chat, go ahead and write if you've heard any of these, or any of these have been said to you, or if you've said any of these. I imagine a lot of you have heard these, but hopefully you don't say anything, because these are aspects of being a bad ally, right? So a lot of people use these terms thinking that they're being supportive, but really they're hurtful and harmful to our mission. So telling you that my friend is blank and they agree with me, that's bad allyship there. And we're gonna go over what good allyship means later. So let's go ahead and start with Dr. Green.
Good morning, everyone. I am, for those of you who don't know, I'm actually a native Louisianian. I'm from New Orleans, Louisiana. Grew up in the Ninth Ward of New Orleans. I'm glad to be back home. Allyship means to me a number of the things that Donnie presented to you guys, but it's constantly learning, reevaluating yourself, reevaluating privileges, even though you may not believe you have some, and applying those privileges to situations where you see there's a wrong, and constantly trying to help to alleviate things that you see are wrong. These are built way back in the foundation of our country, as far as if there's a right, you should stand up for those wrongs. But if you see something wrong, you should stand up for those and try to fix those situations. And as far as I'm concerned, there are so many mentors and allies that I have, some of which are still teaching you guys, some of which are still here, and some of which are not even part of this profession, and some of which that are not even professionals in this nature, that have been allies in helping me stay the course in situations where I felt I was wrong. So like I always tell my kids, get comfortable with being uncomfortable, because anytime someone is stretching your belief system, anytime someone is stretching your thought process, you are growing in that. So that's what I hope you get out of this, is to continue to be uncomfortable learning and practicing getting better at helping one another.
Summer, do you want to jump in, or do you want me to go?
Sure, I'll jump in. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure and honor to be here. During my time at LSU, I've had the opportunity to work with the vet school in various capacities. Some of you that are students, I know through NCBI training. Some of you that are on the professional staff have had the opportunity to come in and do some professional development work. So it's always a treat and pleasure for me to get to connect with my colleagues on the total opposite side of campus. So thank you for Donnie and Dr. Gashin for the invitation. I think that Dr. Green did a phenomenal job of laying out what allyship is. In fact, he actually hit on most of the keywords that I was going to say. So kudos to you for doing that. Some things that for me to highlight, that allyship is really, it's a lifelong process. It is a verb, it is not an adjective. So it is active. It is lots of self-reflection and self-evaluation. To me, allyship is about a lot of internal work. A lot of times, I think whenever we think about allyship, we think about the external components of that and how we do things and we engage in things. But without doing that self-work and that constant self-reflection, that constant evaluation, that constant learning and unlearning, you will never really achieve getting to be an ally. One of the other things that I want to point out is that there's an organization that I've had the opportunity to work with. It's called the Women of Color Network. And their purpose is really to amplify and support and grow the leadership of women of color within violence against women movements. And I've learned a tremendous amount from doing work with that organization. And they don't use the term ally or allyship. They use the term aspiring ally, because from the way they frame allyship and ally work is that it's a constant aspiration. It is a constant process of doing and being and becoming. And it's never something that you arrive at, because it's not a destination. So I think that as we think about allyship, those are some important things to keep in mind. You don't get to say, well, I spoke up when somebody said this, and here's my gold star, and now I get to be an ally, and my ally work is done, or I get to move to the next level of allyship. So yeah, just a few things to think about and add to the great wisdom that Dr. Green shared.
Yes, and good morning. And it's hard to follow up on Dr. Green and Summer. I appreciate them both. I appreciate you, Donnie and Lori, for inviting us today. A couple of things I wanted to mention. First, just reintroduce myself. I'm Wes Heath. I'm the Assistant Director of Cross-Cultural Affairs. My pronouns are he, him. And I really got into allyship work growing up in Indiana as an out gay boy who ended up turning into a man, right? So growing up in the society that kept telling me that I didn't exist, Indiana was especially interesting because Mike Pence, who you all know as VP, was also our governor while I was growing up. And there were many occasions throughout his governorship where he felt like queer people didn't exist. They were a myth. They were rebels that were rebuking society. And that was the message I grew up with. And when I got to college, I decided that I needed to take a stand and start doing some work to change that. And that's really where my allyship work began. And then as I went through sociology, and I'm always a proponent for sociology, really brought to light a lot of the things that we're discussing today: social oppression, systemic oppression, hierarchies, privilege, power. These are all common conversations in sociological theory. And so I really have the scholarship and the practitioner background to this that fuels the work that I do today. So on campus, Donnie mentioned a lot of what I do, but one of my favorite things is overseeing the Safe Space campaign, which teaches people how to be good allies to LGBTQ+ people and their intersections of identities, right? And so I did say the word queer. If you have questions about whether or not that's a bad word, we can get to that later on, of course. But there's a couple of things I wanted to mention about allyship and really add to what Dr. Green and Summer were saying. And the first one is that allyship is really bringing to the forefront your privileges. So I mentioned a little bit earlier, as a gay man, there are definitely ways in my life that I felt like I've been marginalized, that and sizeism, but there are also many privileges in my life that I have taken advantage of, right? Whether I chose to or not. And that's really one of the hardest parts about allyship work, is that first hurdle to understand that you have privilege in some ways, and everyone has privilege in some ways, and then how to utilize that privilege to make a difference, and really turning that privilege on its head and getting uncomfortable I think is what Summer mentioned as well. And then the second thing I'll add here, I'm sure there'll be lots more that comes out today, but really understanding the difference between acceptance and support. So as an ally, sometimes I hear people that say that I accept you, or that we are accepting people, or that we accept you into our school, we accept you into our club. And acceptance is not allyship. Acceptance is simply agreeing that something exists. And we argue that everyone exists regardless of whether or not you agree with them. So acceptance really doesn't mean much. But support is really where allyship comes in, and how can you support someone? So if you find yourself saying that a lot, like I accept you, or I accept gay people, I accept Black people, you're not really saying anything. All you're doing is saying, okay, they exist, but really moving into support and finding ways that you can support individuals, regardless of those identities. But anyway, I'll turn it back over, but that's kind of where I wanted to get started.
Great. Thank you all for your explanations of allyship and what it means to you.
I'll hop in and answer this one. I think right now, one of the biggest allies that I see is Dr. Galligan, who is serving as our interim president. He has led us these past several months through pandemic, through campus and national, the racial incidents that have happened in our country, the protests that are happening on campus. And I feel like he's done a tremendous job of listening to the voices of those who have often been silenced, those who have often been pushed to the margins, and listening, hearing, and then acting on what concerns have been brought forward, using his bandwidth to make changes where he can. Wes really talked about that place of being an ally is using your power and using the privilege that you have to impact change. And that's definitely something that I've seen from his leadership the past several months here on campus. Hopefully that's something that all of you have seen as well. So to me, that's sort of a macro level example of an ally. Within my life, thinking about allies that I've had, it really made me realize that most of them are mentors. And I think that goes back to the point that Lori was making earlier in her introduction when she was talking about how, as members of the veterinary profession, either as students or practitioners, everybody had support along the way. And touching that in and tying that into what Wes said about that supportive part of allyship, that great allies don't make it about them, that great allies really meet you where you are and ask what it is that you need, and then how can they deliver that? How can they use what they have access to in order to provide what it is that you need, centering the you in that, right? So centering the not what they think you need, not well, from my observation, I think if you did this, that this would happen, but really saying, what is it that you need? How can I support you? And then following up with meaningful, demonstrated action.
Dr. Green, did you want to add anything to your allyship?
I was going to let you go since I went first the last time.
Okay. I feel like I've talked so much. So in terms of allyship, who are allies in my life? I mean, I surround myself with allies. So I think that's really a hard question to answer. If there's someone that's in my life that is not an ally, I think you weed those people out, right? Like you need the people that are your supports. So I have my friend group that I rely on all the time. I have my colleagues here at work that, and Summer can attest to this, sometimes we just have really bad days at work or really challenging days where our allyship is really tested, and we can message our other colleagues in our office and say, this was a challenging day. I just need you to be with me at this space and acknowledge the work that we're doing and support one another. And we do that really well. In fact, I had a colleague that put the note on my door overnight that said, thank you for being a solid rock in the midst of this pandemic. Your contribution to your team is greatly valued. You are appreciated. And just walking into hearing that this morning really brought some new energy to what is a really early morning for all of us, right? Jump right in at 8 o'clock and start talking about power and privilege is not always easy. But finding that support on my door this morning was really helpful. So I'm very blessed and honored and privileged to have allies throughout my life.
Like I said earlier, there's so many allies that if you start naming names, the list we'd be sitting here for the next hour and a half, 2 hours. But on every level, you have your family as allies that will help support you when things aren't going right or help you find your way through the weeds. You have colleagues that support you. Like I said earlier, we had so many mentors and allies here in a veterinary school when I was a student, being one of 2 Black students in my class. And then I had a bunch of classmates that actually stepped up as allies, named Lisa DiBernardi, James Ireland, as a couple of them that were just stand out, helping me through times when I was finding myself to be sort of a loner in school. Brian Slinker, who's retired dean at Washington State University, unexpected mentor and ally that constantly pushed me to be better. My former co-worker, Dr. Dan Hogan, constantly refining the way I thought about things, the way I approach things. Sandy San Miguel, Dean Reed. So there's just a number of allies that you'll find, and oftentimes they're in unexpected places from unexpected people. So I always tell my students, don't ever close a door, because you never know who's standing behind that door to help you. So this part of allyship is also accepting it to some extent.
I think it's Wes's turn to go first.
Out of the hot seat. Okay. Well, I think so I mentioned earlier, the first step you have to take is recognizing your privilege. I think that's the first step to allyship. You can't be a good ally if you don't understand the areas in your life that you're privileged. The second thing, I think, is understanding that we all have implicit bias in some way or another, and recognizing that implicit bias exists, that you have it, and that we are not somehow magically the only person on earth that's immune. But it's our responsibility to take accountability for that and to educate yourself. And I think education is the third important component here. You have to educate yourself. You have to put in the time, you have to put in the work. Just like becoming a veterinarian requires schooling and practice and repetitive measures and feedback and constructive criticism. And sometimes it requires failing in order to become better. The same applies to becoming a better ally. You really have to put in the work. You have to test yourself. You have to make yourself uncomfortable. You have to do your own readings. You have to do your own investigating, because at the end of the day, it relies on you, and you can't rely on people within the communities that you're trying to be an ally to educate you and to hold yourself accountable, to hold you accountable, because that's not effective allyship. So let's just say you're a white identified person. You're trying to be an ally to your Black colleagues and peers. You can't rely on your Black colleagues and peers to call you out if you make a mistake. You have to be able to hold yourself to that accountability, and you have to rely on other white people to hold you accountable as well, because that is their role. So understand your privilege, understand you have implicit bias, and get educated. I think are some of the top three that I would say.
So I would have to agree with all those things you said, Wes. Those are pertinent to every aspect of growing. I'll use a little bit of a personal example here. Growing up as a Black man in New Orleans, I had developed implicit biases against the LGBTQ community, homosexuality, as we were growing up knowing it. And that was something I had to grow past and learn past that. A lot of things that I was taught was implicitly wrong, and developed very strong feelings in me at some point in time. And growing up in a religious background, I had to stretch my beliefs and stretch what I was taught. And in doing so, I actively seek situations. I continue to mentor. You stop seeing people for other things other than what they present to you and what they give you. It was something I had a difficult time with in my teenage and 20s years, because we were being taught differently and learned differently. So it's something I had to grow past. And I can attest to being in Indiana all those years, Wes, how the feelings were towards that community and all the work that that went into getting people to look beyond certain stereotypes. And growing up having those stereotypes placed on me in a lot of different ways as a Black man, I had to understand that those same things were being placed on other communities as well.
Yeah, I have the challenge spot of coming last and following up both Wes and Dr. Green. I would add to that I think allyship and becoming better allies is often about leaning out. We hear a lot about leaning in, particularly in terms of our own personal leadership, but in order for somebody to lean in, somebody else has to lean out. So we have to think about, how do we make space for folks who have traditionally been left out? How do we use our positions of privilege and power to amplify the voices that have been silenced? And as we think about how we can be allies in the classroom, how we can be allies and all of those places that Dr. Gashin mentioned, where all of you are operating, asking yourself and doing that reflective work and saying, where would it be more powerful to hear a voice that we haven't heard from before? And taking that opportunity as an ally to make space, to lean out, and then to amplify what other folks are saying. There's a lot of research that shows that folks who are traditionally underrepresented and marginalized, even when their voices are spoken, they're not heard, they're not amplified. We see this phenomenon particularly with women, and it was well documented and well shared that even within cabinet level positions and leadership positions, that women in boardrooms weren't being heard, and they would say something and then a male colleague would say basically the exact same thing, and folks would be like, yeah, that's a great idea. And so what happened was other women in the room started amplifying that voice, and they started supporting that voice. And so we can be allies even within our own groups. So we can be allies to identities that we even hold in some capacity to amplify, to make space, and that support component that Wes talked about.
Thank you all very much. And that's one of the things that we try to do here at the SVM is amplify the voices of our people of color and women by helping them get into leadership positions on different committees, just so that they can share their unique experiences and start to gain some allies and build more community here at the SVM. So thank you for that great point.
Can I add a comment to that?
Please, go ahead.
So kind of specifically adding towards the veterinary school situation and students, because we've talked about the concept, but let's just give you an example of how, as a student, you can be an ally to one of your classmates when you're working in groups. We had a lot of these situations at Purdue University where a lot of students, a lot of our education was based on A&I, which was application integration, small group work. And students of color, students who were shy and quiet by nature, who were form students and only child, students who were LGBTQ community, seem to have their voices damped out in those situations. They may make a comment or state something about a case, and they oftentimes reported feeling ignored, and someone else would make that same statement about a particular case, and everybody would agree to those things. As a student, you can be an ally to that, and to someone's example, and say, hey, Jennifer just made that comment about, or I agree with Jennifer's comment about such and such a thing about this particular case that she just stated a few minutes ago. Just reaffirming, advocating for that student's comments to stand out just as much as the more boisterous student in the crowd. So those are small steps that you can take as a student when you notice that your classmates are being pushed aside, their thoughts are being pushed aside, or those are small steps you can take as a student in developing the concept of allyship in your class.
Dr. Green, I think you mentioned earlier that you have some specific thoughts that you wanted to share about this topic.
Well, we had a specific example of something that happened this summer with that, where it's a topic that is one that's obviously heated and requires a depth of understanding of where it begins, and where on some level, I think it requires a lot of allyship or just understanding of historical context of developing slogans in the Black community and how they've been pushed down in order to suppress that level of development in that community. So as part of the Black Lives Matter movement, a secondary term developed all lives matter, and I know this is always a controversial topic, and originally started basically as meaning to be in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement, but apparently became an opponent based on the fact that it's the community of the Black Lives Matter movement was feeling like it ignored the tensions and the historical context of where the term Black Lives Matter developed. And a lot of times that's where allyship gets confused, where people are not wanting to listen to each other, not wanting to hear each other, and we get back into our corners in our belief system. And I think that's a great example of what's happening to two groups that actually were meaning to help or develop a group that was meaning to be an ally, becoming ostracized and politicized to the point of the Black Lives Matter movement being considered racist, instead of looking at what it's trying to do as far as bringing attention to historical systematic abuses and isolation of a community versus a community that was trying to show solidarity, but also being politicized to saying that it does not understand the strife that the Black community is going through. And that requires one thing that we all seem to have issues with, which is communication. It requires communication, which requires one side listening while the other side speaks, and the other side listening when the other side speaks. And we have to try to stop developing sound bites and having that conversation. And one of the first, just to be a little bit, one of the first grand rounds that I've ever done with related to diversity resulted in a blow up in our school, but it also resulted in communications and people developing relationships that they would never have developed before. So I encourage you guys to have an open conversation, a safe conversation with each other. It doesn't mean you will agree on everything, just like as veterinarians, we won't agree on the treatment for everything. But we can have that conversation with each other, and there may be just more than one way of getting to the same goal.
Thank you, Dr. Green. I agree. Language and communication are vitally important in the work of allyship. I often get pulled back to this dialogue between Black Lives Matters and All Lives Matters. And one thing that we've been seeing that works is when you overly simplify it with a story or a metaphor. So I'll do this and I'll try and make it veterinarian related. So say you have a kitten that's coming into the emergency room, right? And they're saying this kitten needs help. And then your vet tech is like, oh my goodness, but all kittens matter. We can't rush this one. And you're like, but this kitten matters right now because this kitten needs help. So when you come in and you say all lives matter, you're taking away that conversation. You're taking away that help that person is needing, that this community is needing, by simply saying that everyone matters. And we're not disagreeing that everyone does matter, but right now the Black community needs help. And that's what we're saying when we say Black Lives Matter. And we're stuck in a situation with police brutality, centuries of systemic oppression, and Black Lives Matter, and language matters. So be sure that you're using the correct language. I know it's an oversimplification, but hopefully maybe it adds some perspective.
I'll say ditto to both.
Great, thank you both. And what Wes and Dr. Green mentioned, it sounds like you're referring to crucial conversations. So we know that crucial conversations is where we have differing opinions, strong emotions, and high stakes situations. So I think we all could learn how to navigate those situations a little better. So that's one of the opportunities that we offer here at the SVM for faculty and staff to go through, just so that we can have these uncomfortable, difficult, crucial conversations, so that we can help everyone and become allies to all people. So thank you for that. Shameless plug.
it's important for veterinarians for your survival in this profession. just put it plain and simple. And it's seen, there's so many examples where you can be an ally even in clinics. I'll give one of the best examples that I heard. I was doing a talk with the Black DVM Network, and a student came across, this was an interview actually with a student that I brought up during the Black DVM Network, where, and I'm sure you've heard this as students, or will hear this as students, and hopefully won't as much anymore. What a shame these people have this animal that they can't take care of it. They can't afford to take care of it. And at that point in time, as a clinician, I've heard that statement. I've heard a statement about, why did this veterinarian do this? Sometimes understanding that the circumstances may be different than what you are picturing the circumstances to be. First off, understanding that you're privileged to have a knowledge that maybe that person who owns that pet doesn't. Maybe you are privileged to be able to take care of an animal differently than that person. And so you can use your allyship or your privilege. In that point in time, I used mine as a professor to teach the students about situations, situational medicine, or just looking at things in context from a different perspective than yours. I think little things like that will help your practice grow. Understanding that everyone can't do the things that you would really want to do to help save that animal at times, or sometimes it's just not within that person's belief system. There are differences, and we have to understand those differences. And in understanding those differences, we won't turn off clients. We'll actually be more accepting and find a variety of ways to help that patient, and that will allow us a bevy or a diversity of treatment options for that owner, instead of just saying, well, since you can't afford the best, we don't have anything else for you. So it will help you thrive and survive, I think, in all aspects of your practice to some extent, to have an open mind and when it comes to viewing how just the interaction of the human-animal bond.
Thank you, Dr. Green. That was a perfect answer. In the interest of time, I do want to move on to Q&A.
I'll hop in and I'll make a connection to the NCBI work that the vet school has incorporated into the student experience. So part of NCBI is really looking at our various identities. And those of you that are students, if you think back to that up-down activity where we go through, gosh, I don't know, probably 20 to 30 different identity categories. And knowing that in some of those, there are places where you have an amount of privilege and an amount of power. Sometimes that's situational. Sometimes you will, thinking of those of you that are students, that whenever you're in your student role, you're not in that position of power and privilege. But when you're working in a clinic and you're working with a client, then you are, because you're the expert. So I think understanding, one, that our identities can sometimes be situational, and that they can change depending on the situations that we're in, and that our identities are multiple, that often part of having a privileged identity is that we don't have to think about it. So I don't necessarily have to think about my whiteness. I don't have to think about my able-bodiedness, because I am not navigating a space where I'm having to plan and think and figure out, how is this space going to be accessible to me? So really doing, I think, an identity inventory, and we can even share with all of you, if it would be helpful, some of those identities that we go through in NCBI. So even thinking about things like social class, are you a first generation college student? Do you have a learning difference? Are you neurotypical? Do you have, again, a body that can move with your own legs? Do your arms work? All of those are privileged identities, and because we don't have to think about them, we often don't think of them as being core parts of who we are.
Would either of the other panelists like to jump in?
I don't know how one could follow that, because that was pretty close to what we might consider perfect. So that was really good, Summer. Thank you. I think that's a tough question. I don't think anyone wakes up one day and just like, today's the day that I become an ally. Now, if you haven't had that conversation, maybe that day could be today. But I think for me, and I just think from personal experience, when I started seeing marginalization, when I started seeing people in positions of power making decisions for people that had no power, I think that's when I was like, this is something that I really think needs to change. And then when I began learning about my own privileges, I didn't like it. I didn't like that I had been given things in my life that I hadn't earned. And I was like, this is entirely unfair. I want to change this. I think the world needs to change. And I think those realizations came in over time. And then as every day, I think it gets more and more solidified. So I don't know, that was my experience. It was over time, it was gradual. Every day I'm still learning. And just like was mentioned earlier with Dr. Green and with Summer, both said this, it is not something that you get to call yourself. It is a title that you have to earn every single day. So it's not something like, hey, I did my allyship thing for the week, I'm done, gold star, I can wait till next week now. It's not like that. So it is something you have to consistently strive for. And so that's been my experience.
I will say for me, there was an actual moment, and in the interest of time, I won't share that whole story, but it boils down to my allyship was solidified for me whenever I realized I never had to be an ally, that I could decide that this work was too hard and just go back to living my life and living, choosing to be ignorant and realizing that, again, if I wanted to stop doing anti-racism work because of my whiteness, I could absolutely stop doing anti-racism work and just be me. And that's whenever I realized there are folks who have identities that are corporeal in nature, that are not malleable in nature, that they can't take off and on. And that if I truly care about people, both individual people in my life, and then that sort of general sense of caring about people, that being an ally is a core part of that. And it's a core part of who I am, and that I can take it off. And because I can take it off, I challenge myself to never take it off.
I think that was ingrained in me as my father always taught me to look out for my neighbor next door, always to look out for the, and to, when I'm walking down the street, you never walk past someone without saying hi to them. And being sincere, if you ask them how you're doing, not just making it a blow-by comment, but actually if you're asking, you want to know the answer to that question. So that was something that was ingrained in me by my dad, and my sisters growing up. So I didn't realize it was allyship at the time, but as I continued to learn more, I did found out that's what we were doing the whole time. Great question. You plant the seed by your example, is what I say. You can't change someone's heart, and you can't get frustrated by someone who feels different than you about all of these topics. I always equated diversity topics when I spoke about this is to make a joke about how I know people felt when we used to go around called Bible thumping. Oh, here they come again. And all I feel like you can do at that point in time is by your example, plant a seed. You can't force them to change. You can't force someone to change their heart, and hopefully they'll see by example that it's a better way to go than the reactions that you would typically have.
I think just part of it is understanding that we as humans, we tend to hate the things that we don't understand. And it seems to be a pretty quick common reaction. And if you've ever taken an NCBI training, and if you haven't, I suggest you sign up at some time. But one of the core tenets that we have throughout those workshops is that we don't change people's minds. We don't change people's thought process by just spewing facts at them. We change people's hearts by telling personal stories, right? So oftentimes when people don't want to be your ally, it's because they don't really understand what you've been through. They don't understand you as a person. They don't understand your identities. And it's easier to hate that than it is to sit there and try and understand the intricacies that make that person unique and make that person special. So I, it's always the people that hate you the most are probably the ones that really just need to learn your life struggle, learn your life history, learn about those identities. So don't write them off, but at the same time, protect yourself. If that person's just a really negative, toxic person in your life, then, protect yourself as well. That's important.
Thank you both so much. I do want to share one more thing. This is the Good Ally screen that we wanted to put up here, just so you can have a few different phrases here that you can say that will show people that you care, that you're a good ally. And hopefully you all have heard some of these things because you have good supportive people in your life. Yeah. Any here that our panelists want to touch on that we didn't get to talk about real quick in the last minute?
I would just add this to the students in your class. I will tell you this: there are students that you'll get to know as friends really closely, and others that you may not agree with and like personally. But when you get in clinics, it's a great equalizer. You will find that you have friends that you didn't know, and people you will grow to learn about things that you didn't know about classmates that you've been sitting with for 3 years in the classroom, because you'll learn to work with some very good people that you didn't expect that you would like. So be open to creating friendships and advocacy for others.
Any final words from Summer or Wes?
I would say that I am here as a resource for all of you. So as Wes said earlier, doing your own work. It's not on the job of folks with identities that maybe you don't fully understand, or you're doing your own work around for them to educate you. But I offer myself as a resource. So if you are struggling with something, or you have a question about something, or what have you, I am happy to be here as a support as you do your work around becoming better allies.
Yeah, and I really appreciate Summer and Dr. Green and all their contributions today in the vet school for hosting this. And I too will offer the also Multicultural Affairs and the LGBTQ+ project as areas of resources and support for you. The last thing that I'll say here is that allyship work can certainly be tiresome. It can certainly have its bad days. And I think that with everything that's going on in the world, it's certainly okay to feel sad and disheartened and to feel like you need to mourn. But at the end of the day, as an ally, it's the anger and it's the motivation that fuels you to make a change. And that's what we need. It's not more tears, it's action. It's getting angry at the problems and how they have been perpetuated. So take care of yourself, be good allies, learn, educate, use inclusive language, and we're here to help.
Great. Thank you all so much for the wonderful discussion that we had today. Please, everyone, let's thank our panelists. Offer appreciation in the chat. Our panelists will be able to stick around for a few minutes, hopefully, if you have any questions that weren't able to get answered throughout the grand rounds. But thank you all so much for coming, and we will send this video out to everyone along with some general allyship tips that you can take back with you